Okay. Now you can start at any time.
So, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Linda. I am a physicist by training, data science master student here at the University of Trieste. And here is my dear friend Romina, brilliant physics PhD student at CISA. A few weeks ago, we saw this opportunity of academic world. So we managed to organize this event, also to organizations, student motto, and sustainability and environmental items, etc. For those of you who know already, Edwin is a vegan educator, public speaker, entrepreneur, and author. Among his great achievements, he as a media and design fellow online, where he goes by Earthling Ed. He is global for video essays, public speeches, and tables at universities. Currently, book tour in Italy as the first of these two books, which are This Vegan and How You With Me. Just got translated in them. Congratulations. And the that related to his animal rights and sustainability work, must use some additional books here in this Italian. So much again, and now this is yours.
Great. Sarah, is that close enough? Lovely. Thank you for coming down to see. We really appreciate it. About 45 minutes or so. Then we'll have to tie the end for some questions. I encourage you to challenge me. If I don't mention something is important, if I mention something is incorrect, challenge me, tell me. The purpose of here is just to tell you what I think, or and encourage you to think differently. It's also an opportunity to maybe voicing questions you have to a vegan and see which commonality. Now, you're already vegans, if you are becoming, and if you're not, you especially becoming. I'm going to speak for environment, and then I'm going to talk about the ethics. And I'm tying both these things together. Now, as a vegan, it's perhaps surprising people to hear very strongly about veganism. Not only strongly, but I think those who can be vegan have obligations to be vegan. I think when we look at the environmental and the ethical considerations that non-human animals should be granted by us humans, I think it's not compelling, but also irrefutable. That's the statement, which is for you to do so, please. Another thing I also say is live in a world, in a time right now, where there's so much information thrust upon us all the time. We go on social media and we so much, and so much we see complete rubbish. As scientific, it is conspiratorial, flat out wrong. And I think that it's really important, perhaps more now than ever, for us to scrutinize the information that we're told as well. So another reason to hopefully encourage you in your time to look into this for yourself. The time that we have together now is really short. We consider the huge nature of this issue in front of us. So if I achieve the inspiration of encouraging you to go do a little more investigating in your own, I'll consider that a job well. So let's get started. Perfect. Thank you. Now, sometimes with the presentation. Formatting gets a little bit messed up on the export, but apart from some different fonts, I think we're good.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Very nice. Yeah, perfect. So, now this title for the talk, it's a little bit on the nose, the power of food. It feels like such a grand statement without really much meaning. But the reason I like to call this the power of food is for two reasons. First, to emphasize the importance of food. Food is something that we partake in every single day as a necessity. It's something we have 3 times a day and snacks in between. Food is an essential part of human experience and human living. But at the same time, not only is it essential, but it's one of the most important decisions that we make every single day. A decision so powerful, and yet at the same time, so often we just make this decision without really thinking it through. We buy the foods we buy because we like them and because we were raised to like them and because they're cultural and traditional. And so little of the time do we stop and think about the choices that we're making. Why am I buying this? What is the consequence of this? Is there someone who has been exploited or harmed as a consequence of this? How do I morally justify this? How do I environmentally justify this? These are really important questions that we should ask ourselves, and yet we very rarely do as a society when it comes to the food choices that we make. And I hope to maybe implore you to understand that food is powerful for so many different reasons. But also this word power can also be used to mean empowering. So often we look around the world and we see so many problems, from the terrible things happening in Gaza to Ukraine to the environmental crisis in general. We see so many terrible things that are happening, and yet we often feel so powerless to stop them. And that's because, truth be told, we are often powerless to stop so many of these issues. And yet food, by the virtue of it being a choice that we make, means that we have an ability to make a decision that can have a huge impact. We're not necessarily just relying on governments or companies or politicians. We can rely on ourselves as citizens, consumers, as everyday people, because the choices that we make have a far-reaching consequence. And that's why food is empowering. Because how often do we have the choice there in front of us to vote for the world that we want to create and live in just by choosing something else? In a restaurant or supermarket or cafe, such a small choice, and yet over time, that small choice can create such a large impact. That's why food is powerful, because of what it represents, and also because of what is possible for us as citizens. Let's start with the environment. Let's go back to 2006, which is now 18 years ago, my goodness. Now, back in 2006, the United Nations released a report called Livestock's Long Shadow. This report was incredibly important because the United Nations was investigating the issue of animal farming, livestock farming. And this quote is taken directly from that report, as you can see. It says the livestock sector emerges as one of the top 2 or 3 most significant contributors at every scale, from local to global, the mysterious environmental problems. The findings of this report suggest that it should be a major policy focus when dealing with problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. So 2006, 18 years ago, the United Nations was warning us that this is an issue, and not only that, but we need policy change. 18 years has gone by. Have we had any policy change? Well, just recently, the European Union did try to bring in some policy change and was met with a fair amount of resistance. There's a certain irony, I think, when farmers protest against environmental regulations by burning manure and asbestos and releasing harmful greenhouse gases. I always think it's kind of comparable to someone being accused of being violent to their children and in protest slapping their child to claim they would never be so violent. The idea that we shouldn't regulate farming or that we shouldn't have policies to create a better form of farming, I think is a very dangerous idea to have. Because actually, we need to change how we farm. This isn't a question of if we should, it's a question of how. And actually the how comes to dietary changes through plants. Okay, let's go back to 2010 now. I screenshot this a long time ago. The UN again released another report, this time urging a global move to a meat and dairy-free diet. In other words, we've known now for a long, long time that we need to change our food system. And yet, nothing is changing from a policy perspective.
Can we ask you to use the microphone?
Oh,
because
yeah.
online people said that online it's still too quiet.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Lovely. Wow. Does make a difference, doesn't it? So then, the UN, the IPCC released a report, Now, this report is huge in scale, as you can see. 782 scientists and hundreds more contributing authors. It analysed more than 66,000 peer-reviewed pieces of research. 66,000. When we think about the scale and scope of this research, it's enormous. And one of the recommendations they wanted to put in place when they published the report was to recommend that a plant-based diet was an important part of trying to create environmental change, a plant-forward diet. And actually what happened is, when this report was sent to delegates in different countries, the meat industry started lobbying. And as a consequence, the meat industry was able to water down the wording in the report. And references to plant-based diets or plant-forward diets were replaced with wording like balanced and sustainable diets, which to the everyday person means nothing. What's a balanced and sustainable diet? We need to be told what that means, because what's balanced to one may not be balanced to another and may not be balanced according to the scientific literature. And I think this is a really big part of the problem. We think about oil and gas and fossil fuels, or tobacco, or whatever harmful industry we may be talking about, and we know that there is this huge system of lobbying, of paid PR people, of consultancy firms that work on behalf of these companies and industries to spread misinformation and to disrupt the political sector. And yet often when we talk about farming, we romanticize these industries. We think of farmers tending to a herd of cattle, how holistic, how natural, how wonderful, how synergistic it seems. And yet actually, the same forces work for the meat, dairy and egg industries. Powerful lobby groups, powerful firms run by PR teams that work solely to try and disrupt the scientific narrative and to spread doubt to the consumer so they continue consuming the foods they've already consumed. This is the problem that we face. This isn't just an issue of presenting science or ethics. This is an issue of trying to disrupt one of the most powerful and financially important industries on the planet, and the political backing they have in the EU, in the UK, and indeed all around the world means they have the power to not only deny the science, but stop it from being presented to us, the people who deserve to have this information placed in front of us. Now, let's talk specifically about emissions for a little while, obviously very important. The United Nations estimates quite conservatively that about 14.5% to 18% of current global emissions are because of the animal farming sector. Now, some estimates place that figure as being higher, but I think 14.5% to 18% is a conservative number, and it still works as a conservative number because, put in perspective, let's say that you take all the planes, all the cars, all the motorbikes, and you think about the emissions being produced by the exhausts of all of the transport around the world combined. The emissions from animal farming alone are higher than the combined emissions of all transportation globally. I mean, it's estimated that aviation is responsible for about 2 to 3% of current global emissions, and animal farming conservatively is 14.5%. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't change how we travel. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't change other things. But it puts into perspective just how important this issue is, and yet how little exposure it gets in so many different ways. Now, a report published by the University of Oxford was looking at what would happen if the emissions from every other sector other than agriculture ceased. And what they found is that the emissions from agriculture alone will take us past 1.5 and maybe even 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Now, obviously, these numbers are significant because these are the numbers that were set out by the Paris Climate Agreement back in 2015. These are the numbers that we don't want to exceed with all sectors combined. And yet agriculture alone will take us past these numbers. So the question of changing how we eat or changing how we produce foods is a question of how, because we can't continue with the way that we are as it becomes more and more painfully apparent. Now, there's this one piece of research that I always talk about: reducing food's environmental impact through producers and consumers. The reason I love this piece of research is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the scope of the piece of research. This piece of research was a huge meta-analysis that combined information from over 1,500 different studies. What it did is it looked at close to 40,000 farms in over 110 countries all around the world. It looked at all different systems of farming, from grass-fed to intensive farming to, of course, crop and arable farming as well. And to date, it is the most comprehensive analysis that's ever been conducted exploring the relationship between farming and the environment. This is the biggest piece of research so far looking at this very issue. And of course, they found some very interesting things. Let's take the lowest impact beef, because right now, beef is having a little bit of a moment. All of a sudden, grass-fed consumers and grass-fed farmers and so-called regenerative animal agriculture farmers are talking about the importance of cattle farming and how actually it's a really great thing for the environment. But the truth is that's not what the science shows us. Because actually, red meat production is the most destructive form of food production that exists on the planet. And even the lowest impact beef that was analysed globally in that report was found to be responsible for 6 times more greenhouse gas emissions and a staggering 36 times more land per kilogram of protein than other plant proteins such as peas. So even the most sustainable beef that was analysed in this study was, of course, far worse than something like peas, a plant protein. Now, in the UK, I never cease to hear this one argument, and it really drives me mad. People say to me, Ed, this vegan thing, right, it's a bit extreme, isn't it? I mean, look, we get that in America, cattle ranching is bad, and in Australia, there's a lot of problems, and of course, in lots of other nations, we know that cattle ranching is bad, but look, in the UK or in the EU, it's done differently here. We have more sustainable farming, and actually, importantly, rather than being vegan, it would be far better for the environment if you just supported local farmers, if you just supported your local British or Italian or French or whoever, if you just supported those producers, then your environmental impact would be far better than getting chickpeas that are imported from abroad or lentils that are imported from abroad. But this logic is very flawed, even when we just think about it for a moment, because the idea that local always equals better would mean that every system of farming would have to be the same, and the only difference would be the distance the foods had travelled. But we know that's not the case. We know that producing soy and legumes is not the same as producing red meat or chicken or bacon. We know that different systems of farming have different environmental impacts. And so really the question isn't the distance the foods have travelled necessarily, but the impact in the full life cycle of that food production. So what is the impact from the beginning to the end of consuming and producing that food? And actually, when we look at beef again, only 0.5% of the emissions attributed to beef come from the transportation, because the majority of the impact is from the farming itself. And actually, if you look at the average EU diet, 6% of the emissions attributed to the average EU diet are from transportation, and yet 83% of the emissions attributed to the average EU diet come from the animal-based foods that are consumed within them. In other words, what we choose to eat is more important than the distance the foods have travelled. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to reduce the environmental impact of transportation. But even sometimes the same food isn't more sustainable just because it's local. A piece of research done in Sweden, looking at tomato production and consumption, found that in people living in Sweden, it was more sustainable for them to buy tomatoes from the south of Europe because of the climate here. Whereas in Sweden and places like that, they have to be grown in greenhouses which use energy. Of course, in southern Europe, that isn't the case. And so sometimes even the same food isn't more sustainable just because it's more local. Now, the reason I say this isn't to confuse all of us, but to challenge the idea that we should support local Italian cheese or local Italian beef or local Italian ham. Because actually, that's not the most important question here, especially, of course, when we talk about the ethics later on. Okay, but when we talk about animal farming, we're not just talking about CO2, carbon dioxide. What we're actually talking about a lot of the time is the greenhouse gas methane. Now, this quote here comes from Inge Anderson, United Nations Environment Programme's Executive Director. And as you can see, it says cutting methane is the strongest lever that we have to slow climate change over the next 25 years and complement necessary efforts to reduce carbon dioxide. So let's split that sentence in half and focus on the first part, the strongest lever that we have to slow climate change. Why? Well, for two reasons. Methane is an incredibly important greenhouse gas in this conversation because of two main factors. First, the impact that it has. The global warming potential of methane, in other words, the amount of heat that it traps when it's been emitted, is far higher than carbon dioxide. What that means is that when it's in our environment, it is trapping heat at a faster rate than an equivalent mass of carbon dioxide. So in other words, bad news. We don't want methane trapping heat in our environment. But there's a silver lining. Now, carbon dioxide is a very stubborn greenhouse gas. When it's emitted into our atmosphere, it sticks around and actually accumulates. It builds up, it compounds over time. But methane doesn't do that because it has what we call a short half-life. In other words, it breaks down in our atmosphere pretty quickly, relatively speaking. In fact, within about 12 to 20 years, it has broken down. What this means is that the methane being produced today won't be having a global warming impact within about 2 decades' time. Amazing, that's great, except we just keep replacing it. Atmospheric methane levels are not decreasing, they're increasing, not just because of agriculture, but obviously because of agriculture as well. And so that methane that's breaking down and is no longer contributing to the warming of our planet is just being replaced by more of the greenhouse gas, which is contributing to the problem that we have. But what if we stopped? What if we reduce the amount of methane being produced? What would that mean? It would mean we'd feel the impact of that within about 20 years. Now, the biggest source of methane emissions in Italy, animal farming. So what if we took animal farming out of the equation here, or in the EU in general? Well, it would slow down the impact of climate change. And importantly, it would buy us time. This is why this discussion is so important for now. Because the longer we delay this solution, the less time we have to deal with the other problematic greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, that is far harder to get out of our atmosphere. And yet, the issue of a plant-based diet could provide a solution to the issue of carbon dioxide as well. Land use. Land use is such an important part of this conversation because what we often don't realize is just how inefficient the production of meat, dairy, and eggs is. Now, again, these figures are taken from that study I referenced earlier, the most comprehensive one done to date. And as you can see from the bar charts, animal agriculture uses 83% of all global agricultural land, 83%. And you'd think for such a large amount of land use, what we get in return would be significant, because it needs to be. And yet, even though it uses 83% of all global farmland, it provides us with only 18% of the calories consumed globally and only 37% of the protein. And yet, as a vegan, I'm always told, where do you get your protein from? Well, I get it from the place that we get the majority of our protein from to begin with, the plants, of course. Now, this is important because what it shows is that producing plants is far more efficient than raising and grazing animals. And what that also means is that we can produce more food using less land by just growing plants for human consumption. This is important because, well, our population is obviously growing. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but with an ever-growing population of humans, how can we afford to feed every mouth on the planet when we consider that the current system that we have is one of the leading drivers of the environmental crisis? Can we really afford to build the problem up more and more to feed an ever-growing population of humans? I would hasten to add no, and I think the science would support that claim. Because not only have we discussed emissions and land use, but within that land use is another important thing to consider. To create farmland means you have to create farmland. That means that things like trees, forests, woodlands, peatlands, wetlands, swamps, incredibly important biodiversity dense areas of land and terrestrial ecosystems are not good if you want to graze cattle or grow cereals and grains to feed to animals. And so actually globally, the biggest driver of deforestation historically and today is animal farming. The number one driver of Amazon deforestation, cattle farming. The second biggest driver of deforestation in South America, soybean farming. But not soybeans for tofu and soy yogurts and tempeh, but soy for animal feed. In fact, 96% of the soya produced in South America is used as animal feed and exported all around the world, including to here, including to the UK, all over the world. And so actually, when we look at the biggest driver of habitat loss, species extinction, and deforestation, the culprit is the animal products we consume. And why? Because they're the biggest user of land globally. No other industry comes close when it comes to the amount of land attributed to this industry. And that makes a lot of sense. When we get the train through Italy, or the train through the EU or wherever, what do we see? Huge expanses of fields, either pastures or fields to produce crops, the majority of which are fed to animals. In fact, according to research by Greenpeace, at least 71% of the EU's farmland is used to feed animals. And 63% of arable land is used to produce crops for animals. In fact, according to the European Commission, about 2/3 of the cereals consumed in the EU are consumed by the animals. So even the majority of the plants we're growing are not being fed directly to us, but filtered through the animals who we then slaughter to consume ourselves. This is why we talk about inefficiency, why we talk about a misuse of land. Because not only are we using far more land than we need to produce the food we consume, but on top of that, to produce that land means to destroy that land. And the EU and the UK, when we were in the EU, was one of the biggest deforesters as an area of land, because we were creating such huge expanses to produce animal products. And we didn't need to do that. And the consequence of that is biodiversity loss. The consequence of that is stored carbon being released into our atmosphere. The consequence of that is less flora to store CO2, which brings me to the next point after these points. Only 23% of species and 16% of habitats under the EU nature directives are considered in good health. Now, this is incredibly important when we talk about Italy, because Italy is a biodiversity hotspot, not just in Europe, but indeed all around the world. It is one of the most biodiversity dense areas on our planet. And so what happens to biodiversity here is especially important, because the numbers of animals and the numbers of plants that we're talking about, in fact, as you can see, Italy is one of Europe's biodiversity hotspots, home to half of the nearly 20,000 plant species and a third of the nearly 100,000 animal species living on the continent. So what happens here is so important when we talk about how we utilize land and how we protect and preserve nature. But it's not just about the impact here, but of course abroad as well. I just mentioned soy, but Italy is a huge importer of soy to be used as animal feed. 3.2 million tons annually are imported from around the world. The biggest exporters, of course, being places like Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, and the United States. And of course, 3 of 4 of those are incredibly important areas, again, for biodiversity. Now, the biggest consumers of soy, chickens and pigs. And so actually, when we consume chicken, say Italian chicken, maybe it comes with a little Italian flag on it, and we think about supporting Italian farmers. We're not just supporting Italian farmers, we're supporting Brazilian deforesters. Argentinian deforesters. We're supporting companies and organizations that have traces and links to huge companies like JBS and Cargill. JBS, for example, has been implicated in the displacement and murder of indigenous activists. Not just deforestation, not just the killing of wildlife, but the killing of humans, including indigenous activists and environmental campaigners. So that Italian chicken or Italian ham that we consume, the blood wasn't just necessarily spilled in the Italian slaughterhouse, and the deforestation wasn't necessarily one that occurred here, but indeed occurred somewhere else around the world. You see, the issue of food is an issue of a globally connected system. And the choice we make when we go into a supermarket here isn't just a choice that impacts us, but of course has a far-reaching impact, potentially to areas around the world we've never really considered that we'd have an impact on. Here's the silver lining. Evidence shows time and time and time and time and time and time again that when we take animals out of areas of land, farmed animals, and we rewild and restore those areas of land, not only do we have a benefit to our environment, but we provide habitats and homes, and we allow biodiversity to increase because we're removing the culprit that has led to their loss. Such a simple solution. And this is how it relates to carbon dioxide. I added another slide in. We'll get to how it relates to carbon dioxide in just a moment. Here's the problem. Now, one of the reasons why I terribly hate Brexit, let me just say that, okay? But one of the reasons why there was a silver lining in Brexit is because of the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which is the EU's subsidy policy. Now, subsidies are incredibly important. In fact, they are one of the reasons why we have access to so much food. One of the reasons why so much of that food is affordable. One of the reasons why we have an abundance of energy. The problem that we have is that subsidies, historically and to this day, are being used to fuel industries that have a huge amount of environmental damage. And in the European Union, 80% of the payments given to farmers are given to animal farmers. 80%. It's estimated, I think, that about 40% of the EU's entire budget is subsidizing farming, which means about 32% of the entire budget of the European Union is subsidizing animal farming, the biggest driver of things like biodiversity loss, habitat loss, and one of the biggest causes of greenhouse gas emissions, and the biggest cause of methane, one of the most important greenhouse gases we need to contend with. Our taxpayers' funds is being spent on these industries which are causing clear and obvious harm to us, to animals, to our planet. How can it be right that this happens? And the irony is, the only reason we can eat so much meat is because of subsidies. If we take away the subsidies, most of us would never be able to afford things like red meat. It becomes such a rarity because as an industry, it's not financially viable. It's not profitable. It doesn't make sense. It requires far too much land. It takes far too long to produce the food. And as a consequence, consumers could never spend enough to justify its existence. It exists because of our politicians giving our taxpayer funds to these industries to make them financially possible. What an absolute travesty. How unbelievable is this? And the irony is, vegans get criticized all the time by the right wing, free market capitalists, and yet they don't even understand that the system that they're promoting only exists because of left-wing financial policies, subsidies. In a truly free market capitalist system, the industry wouldn't be able to survive because it doesn't make sense from a financial perspective. So wrong in so many ways. But imagine if all of these funds were not given to cattle farmers, were not given to dairy producers or to chicken farmers and grain producers who produce grain for animals. Imagine if these subsidies were given to landowners to produce fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes. And imagine if they were given to landowners to rewild their land, to increase biodiversity, to store carbon. Imagine the potential that is there in front of us if we just simply allocated the funds that we give to our governments, if we just allocated them more fairly, more sensibly, with more scientific backing. Imagine the potential of what could be achieved. Imagine what could happen if we just used public money for public good, the very thing it's meant to be spent on. Our public money is not meant to be going to the pockets of people who are often millionaires already. The amount of this money that goes to rich landowners just so they can maintain the land that they have is absurd and frightening. This is corruption from the top, all the way through this system. And who loses? We lose. The animals lose. It is unfair, it is unjust, it is unequal, and it is absolutely beyond any sense of comprehension. But the possibility of what could be is so exciting. What could be? Perfect. Now, we've discussed a lot of the problems, we've discussed why they're problems, but one thing that we did discuss is that plants are more efficient. We need less land to produce food in a plant-based food system. How much less? But the map kind of gives it away a little bit. But actually, according again to the most comprehensive piece of research conducted, looking at farming and the environment, in a plant-based food system, we could feed every mouth on the planet and also free up an area of land equivalent in size to the whole of Australia, the whole of China, the whole of the European Union, and the whole of the United States combined. An area of land that size no longer being needed for agriculture. We can feed every mouth on the planet and free up all of this land at the same time. That's incredible, because what can we do with that land? We can return it to nature. We can rewild it, reforest it, regrow it, restore it. Amazing for biodiversity and also for the capturing of carbon. Because how do plants grow? Through photosynthesis. They literally sequester CO2 from our atmosphere, store the carbon in their biomass and the roots and the trunks, and then release the oxygen as a byproduct. They literally help us remove the CO2 that's in our atmosphere just through the process they use to grow. And this is why Inga Anderson said, the United Nations Environment Programme's executive director, that cutting methane is the strongest lever we have to slow down climate change over the next 25 years and complements necessary efforts to reduce carbon dioxide. This is why. Because the solution of a plant-based food system doesn't just tackle the problem of animal farming, but it creates a solution for the other issues that we currently face as well. Other issues that are just as important, but a plant-based food system is a fundamental part of this puzzle. It is a huge piece of this puzzle because it is not just about emissions. It is not just about land use. It is about biodiversity. It is about land use. It is about water pollution, soil acidification. It is about so many things beyond just emissions. It encapsulates so much. But let's put some numbers to this. What would it look like if we were to return these lands to nature? Well, it's estimated that a plant-based food system on its own would reduce global emissions by about 15%. Some say a little bit more, some say a little bit less. 15% is kind of in the middle. Then, let's say we couple this with rewilding areas of land. In doing so, we could remove about 8.1 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent every single year for the next 100 or so years. That figure is about another 15%. So just a plant-based food system with returning these lands back to nature on its own would allow us to tackle about 30 or so percent of the problem that we currently face. Now imagine if we did that alongside green energy, green transportation, alongside changing how we produce clothing, alongside changing how we produce homes and residential buildings and offices and the materials we use. Imagine if we did this alongside all of these other things. How incredibly exciting is that? This is why I love this conversation about food, because it is terribly demoralizing, upsetting, but at the same time, it's so exciting. The potential of something so simple in nature, but so profound in impact. I find that so incredibly exciting. And this goes back to what I said at the beginning. This is a choice that we have. Of course we need policy change. Of course we need the EU and our governments to do things to actually help farmers transition and to encourage consumers to change. But also we can create this change on our own as well through the choices that we make. That's so exciting. every single day, we can decide the future of our planet through the choices that we make. How exciting, how empowering, how unifying. The idea that together as individuals but as communities we can do things that create radical, positive, fundamental change, to me is just such an exciting proposition. But, and there is always a but, isn't there? That relies on us doing something. But unfortunately, future trends are not suggesting that we are doing enough. Because of course, globally, it's not always the same story in terms of awareness and change. And of course, like we discussed earlier, our population is growing. But beyond that, the amount of animal products we're consuming per capita is growing globally as well. And so in 26 years' time, 2050, it's estimated that our consumption of animal-based food will be 70% higher than our consumption of ruminant meat, red meat, the biggest contributors when it comes to deforestation, habitat loss, species extinction, and methane emissions. 88% higher than it currently is. Now, to put that into perspective, we saw the map which showed how much land we could save in a plant-based food system. To create the space to produce this extra amount of animal-based foods would require an area of land equivalent in size to almost 2 Indias. On top of what we already have, on top of all the problems we currently have, where is this land? Where are these trees that we're going to cut down? Where are these animals that we're going to kill and drive to extinction? It is just unfathomable to me that we continue down this road to contribute more to these problems when there are solutions in front of us. But the problem is to do this, more intensification, more unethical farming practices, like multi-story buildings like we see in places like China, of just towers of pigs kept in these concrete prisons. So cruel, so unethical. And yet that is the only way we'd even be able to remotely meet the demand that's expected. It's the only way we can meet the demand that exists now, let alone what it will be in 26 years' time. Do we as a species, as compassionate people, believe that's right? To cause so much harm for something so unnecessary, so needless. A meal, 15 minutes, a meal, a steak. We eat it, we enjoy it, but then it's done. The experience is over. And it's not just the experience that's over, the animal's life is over. And it's not just that their life is over, but they have to endure so much in the life that they were forced to endure. And not only that, but the harm that came environmentally as a consequence of that. And not only that, but the harm that comes to us, to our health, to our well-being as a consequence of this. Because not only do we subsidize animal farmers, we subsidize the environmental cleanup costs. Who pays for rivers and streams to be cleaned? We do. Who pays for the healthcare? We do. We pay for everything, they pay for nothing. And we feel the consequences and the harm of that. Such a broken system, such a broken world, and yet it doesn't have to be this way. Such a simple solution. Why would it not be the obvious solution? It's the question I perhaps posed to you. Oh, I just gave it away. An optical illusion. You may have seen it before. I present you 2 lines, line A and line B. And I say to you, which line is bigger? Now, this is an optical illusion, a very famous one. You may well have seen it before. But the interesting thing is both lines are actually the same. But because of slight differences, how the lines are in the top and bottom, our initial perception of line A and line B create the idea that both lines are actually different sizes, that one is larger than the other. But that's just because of our perception. The lines are the same and should be viewed the same, but our mind plays a trick on us and causes us to perceive the lines as different. Why do I say this? Line A and line B, we should view them the same, but our perception, how we perceive them, means that we view them differently. But why? Why would we view a dog and a pig differently outside of cultural norms? Because there's nothing really that differentiates them apart from aesthetic differences or the noise they make or the certain behaviors they have. But fundamentally, they are sentient, conscious, feeling beings with personalities and experiences and brains and nervous systems, complex animals, individuals that form incredibly complex species. Animals who we really should be viewing as being the same in terms of how we treat them, but instead we treat them incredibly different simply because of the perception we have. Now, in the EU, in the UK as well, in Australia, and more so in the US, the main way that we stun pigs, render them unconscious, is in gas chambers. Now, imagine if someone tried to do that to a dog. They would be arrested, they'd be charged with animal cruelty, but not when it happens to pigs. If you do it to a pig, you can get a paycheck. And not only that, you can call yourself humane. These industries call things like throat slitting and gas chambers humane, ethical, compassionate. Farmers will tell you that they have the best interests of these animals at heart while forcing them into gas chambers. How could there not be a clear contradiction there? How can you claim to care about someone, to have their best interests at heart, to be compassionate to someone, when the reason you have raised them and fed them is not because you care for their well-being, but because you want to make them as fat as possible to extract as much money from them as possible? Because you know exactly where they're going. And we can never claim the place where they go is a place that's compassionate or benevolent. That would go against our intellect. We're clever species. We are clever as individuals. We're empathetic. We have the ability to be compassionate. To try to disguise what we do to animals under labels such as humane or ethical is, I think, to be disingenuous to who we are as a species. Because we are intelligent. And yet when it comes to this issue, often we become irrational. We allow emotion or cultural norms, or we appeal to things like history or tradition to justify something that has no place in the modern society. Now look, there's no denying that we've done what we've done to animals for a long time in terms of eating them. But the question of morality and ethics isn't a question of longevity. The question isn't, have we done this thing for a long time? But how do we justify it today? Because there are many things that we as a species have done and did do for a long time that we thankfully realized was immoral. And hopefully we'll continue to realize that some of these things are immoral into the future. Because the question of ethics and morality is a question of evolution as well. A question of challenging ourselves to think differently, to think deeper, to think more critically. We can come to institutions like this to be critical thinkers, to challenge ourselves intellectually, to think deeper about different things and to learn. And the human experience is a learning experience, always will be. And isn't that beautiful that we can always learn and grow and change and adapt and evolve, not just physically, but intellectually, academically, to explore, to discover. And the discovery of animal ethics and the exploration of animal ethics, I think is incredibly exciting because it allows us to position ourselves in a manner in which we wish to be perceived. What I mean by that is, how do we want to be viewed? How do we want to be looked upon? As kind, compassionate, caring, empathetic people? Perhaps. I would hope so. And how does that characterization that we aspire to fit into what we do to animals? Is it more compassionate to harm, exploit, mutilate, and kill animals, or to not? Is it more ethical to force sentient beings into gas chambers and slaughterhouses, or to not? Is it more humane to take someone's life from them needlessly, or to not? These are fundamental questions, and yet also, I think, obvious in their answer. And so when we think about the animals who we farm and who we exploit, the issue of veganism isn't something radical. I don't have to convince you of something you do not already believe. Because if I said to you, hey, would you like a world that has less violence, less bloodshed, less terror, less screams of agony, and also within that world, be able to produce more food at a more affordable price in a more accessible and sustainable manner? Who would say no? Who would say no to such a proposition? And yet that's what veganism is. It is a pursuit of reducing harm, suffering, violence, and death, and also the pursuit of producing food in a more sustainable, accessible, affordable way. But it's beyond that. The biggest driver of antibiotic resistance, the farming of animals. The biggest driver in the emergence of bird flu and swine flu viruses that could cause the next pandemic, the farming of animals. The issue of what we do to animals isn't just centered on the animals themselves or indeed our environment, but centers on us as well. Because when we choose to buy chicken or bacon or any animal product, we choose to increase all of these things I just mentioned, increase the risk, the severity, the prevalence of all of these different things. And yet to choose the opposite is to decrease the prevalence, severity, and existence of all of these different things. We see images like this, and it makes sense to us. Cow equals steak. No moral objection for many people, and yet a dog equaling a steak becomes morally wrong. Recently in South Korea, they have pledged to phase and ban the production of dog meat. And for most of us, we celebrated that in the Western world. We said, this is fantastic. Finally, South Korea has woken up to the fact that farming and eating dogs is immoral. It is. And yet we celebrate something that we ourselves are guilty of. Except we point the finger at other cultures and condemn them because the animals who they exploit and kill are the animals we don't want to exploit and kill. We point the finger and condemn them for something that we do just to an animal who oinks rather than barks, or moos rather than meows. And yet morally and ethically, there is no distinction. This is why I don't have to convince you of something you don't already believe, because we already believe that animals matter morally. We already believe that species of animals possess traits like sentience and the capacity to experience that means that we as humans have a moral, I'm enjoying it very much, have a moral obligation to act in accordance with our ethical obligations. You already believe that. If you go home tonight and you see someone kicking a dog or kicking a pig or kicking a chicken, you would already believe that to be wrong because you recognize that the animals are a victim in that scenario. And yet the animals who we harm, only wish they would be killed. Right? Well, I'm almost finished, guys. In fact, I'm finished now. Thank you so much for listening. Look, vegans have a bit of a reputation. We can often be perceived as being forceful, as being militant, as being judgmental. And throughout the talk, I use a lot of strong emotive words: wrong, unethical, immoral. But I also think it's really important to mention at the end that these words are not to say that people are bad people. We live in a complex world where we often engage in harmful and bad practices, not because we are bad or harmful people in nature or through aspiration, but because of the world that exists around us. And this conversation about veganism can become so challenging because it speaks to so many issues. And it also speaks to things like culture, the foods we enjoy, family, socializing, religious festivities like Christmas or Easter or Eid, whatever it may be. And so this issue is not one that is just grounded in rationality, but is grounded in so much. Many of these things are very complex. And so when I use these words, it's not to say that those of you who aren't vegan that I believe to be bad or believe to be the enemy, let's say, because I don't believe that to be true at all. I was raised non-vegan. My family is still a non-vegan. Do I love them? Of course. Do I hate the person I used to be? Of course not. Because we live in a complex world where many of the decisions that we make are not decisions we're necessarily consciously aware of. We don't necessarily realize how unconscious we are in our decision-making, how blinded we are by advertising and marketing and history and tradition. And so as a consequence, it can become easy for us to become swallowed up in this system that exists around us and is normalized to us every single day. But the perfect thing that I think symbolizes what we can achieve as a species, maybe differently to other species, is the fact that we can progress in such remarkable ways because we are intellectually incredible. The things we can achieve are unbelievable. Our species is flawed, we do terrible things, and yet we are amazing. The things we can achieve, the things we have achieved, the things we will achieve. I don't think we should ever downplay just how amazing we can be and should aspire to be. And so whilst it may be true that we engage in these systems which are bad, the thing about being human is that we have the ability to challenge ourselves, to humble ourselves, to express humility, to be open to learning, to have the desire for curiosity. It is what has grounded our evolution intellectually for thousands of years. I strongly believe this issue of veganism and animal ethics, whilst not being the only issue that exists, and not being the only social justice issue that exists, far from it, sadly, but I do believe it is one of the most exciting issues that we as a species can challenge and change alongside everything else that also needs to be challenged and changed as well. So thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. And if I haven't spent too long speaking, maybe a little bit too long, and if we have some time left perhaps, I would love to do some questions as well. So thank you for listening. Also, speaking a little fast, so I apologize. Yes, I did an event, and the organizer was like, slow down. And I felt like I was in slow motion at times. So if I spoke a little fast at any point, I apologize, and I hope that hope it was all clear.
So let's do questions.
Yes.
Do you want a seat while you do the questions, or are you fine?
I'm happy to stand.
Okay,
It's good.
let's hear if you do.
Thank you. It is tempting. Yes.
Let the young ones first, if they have a question ready.
Sure. Any questions from anyone? Yeah.
I think your presentation was well put, but I feel it lacks something.
Tell me.
You briefly touched upon it already, but I don't think that's an issue of data, because if it was, we would be all convinced. We will be all vegan. So my question is this, do you have any hints, any strategies about going on communication?
Yeah. Well, I think I sincerely admire your optimism, and I totally agree with you in the sense of the question. Did anyone hear at the back? Maybe not. I can repeat the question. The question that was asked was, it's not just a question of data, right? Because if it was, people would be vegan, it wouldn't be hard to convince people, right? There's something else here. So is this an issue of communication? Is it an issue of conveying this message? Does that summarize what you said? Yeah. And it's a really good question, because it isn't just an issue of data. Whilst I don't necessarily share your optimism in the sense of, I don't think that when people are presented with data, they then make the decisions. I think the issue that the scientific community has is not the research. The research is there and it's incredible. It's how to get this research in front of people. And the problem that we have, and this is probably what you're alluding to very nicely, is that we exist in a time where if you say to someone, hey, look at this this piece of research, it's super complex and really interesting, they're not necessarily going to be interested. But if they see a headline and the headline reads, vegans at higher risk of broken bones, and vegan parents responsible for killing vegan baby. Now that's clickable, right? That's clickable, and it's shareable, and it tells someone what they want to hear. And the problem that we have, not just in this issue, but in all issues generally, is most people are not trained in things like scientific literacy or media literacy or even critical thinking. We as a species are very intelligent, but we're also very irrational. We're driven by biases, sort of confirmation bias, where we seek out information that reaffirms what we wish to be true. We're driven by things like status quo bias, where we want to just keep things as they are, or we get tied into doing what groups do, groupthink. We do something because everyone else is doing it, and well, if they're doing it, I don't have to worry about it. And this means that we then stop engaging with the data, with the science, and we don't actively look for it, because A, it's a bit boring to read. The scientific community uses lots of acronyms and terminology, and if you understand it, great, but if you don't, it's like opening up a dictionary in a language you don't understand, right? And trying to make sense of it. It's really hard. And so the issue we have is, how do we convey this? And the problem is, while we have a media that is sensationalist by nature, and while we have a media that is politically motivated and has biases itself, and wants to perpetuate certain narratives to suit its agendas, then we have a problem. Now, add to that in Italy, you guys have a government that is not favourable of plant-based diets, has banned cell-cultured meat, which is remarkably hypocritical censorship of the private sector, which is, I think, quite ironic. But also what we have now is a tying in of veganism within the culture wars. And so now veganism isn't just about data, it's about politics. It's about how does this work in the left-right binary. And all of a sudden what we have now is a very, very active message being perpetuated by the right wing, which is that veganism is trying to subjugate us, trying to remove our freedoms, trying to claim land and remove farmers from their land, remove heritage, remove tradition, remove centuries of history. And in replace, often what these narratives are trying to tell us is that in the place of these farms, we're going to create social housing for refugees and illegal migrants, right? And this very toxic messaging is being used to perpetuate the idea that veganism is a direct challenge to the prosperity of a nation's sovereignty or a nation's position in the world. And so now it's not about data. It's not about this because the environment is a data-driven issue as well as a physical, visceral issue. We can see what's happening as well as study it. But even something so obvious and so undeniable and so there in front of us is still denied by politics, by politicians, by political identities, by ideologies that are not just simply political. And as a consequence of that, even something so substantiated, so full of evidence, and has been for decades, is still something we have to challenge people to even care about, to think about, to consider an issue. So it's not an issue of data, it's an issue of how do we combat this messaging. Now add to all of that, that veganism now is being tarnished with being unhealthy because of synthetic meats, fake meats, and how this idea of a natural diet, an ancestral diet that's around liver and red meat and eggs is now the healthiest diet because, oh, we don't want to eat these chemicals made by these companies that are producing plant-based burgers. And the thing is, again, the evidence very clearly shows that these plant-based alternatives, even though they're not as healthy as legumes and whole grains, are still healthier than the processed meats they're trying to replicate. But that's not what people want to hear. What people want to hear is these are filled with chemicals and additives and they're bad for us, they're going to kill us. And so we really do have an issue. So how do we get through to people? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think that the only way we can get through to people is by focusing on low-hanging fruit. Open-minded, predominantly younger people who have a natural inclination towards caring about the future, who probably have more or less ingrained views about animals and how they should be treated, and who are probably more open to the idea of viewing animals morally and viewing food in this environmental conversation. I think that's important because the world changes not because everyone wants it to, but because enough people make it. And that's really important. There will always be people who will disagree with something, but the world can change around them. And so through messaging, I think, use data and use storytelling, appeal to people where they wish to be appealed to. Some people will resonate well with the environmental stuff, maybe who are academically minded, logically minded like yourself. Some people may be appealed to the ethical argument more because they have dogs in their homes or because they maybe it's slightly more empathetic than someone else, or maybe they've had an experience that's allowed them to feel more deeply about this. So there are many ways to get through to people, and I think it's about playing to what people care about. And actually, even in talking about politics, like I mentioned, this issue of animal farming, it transcends politics in many ways, but also there are right-wing arguments for veganism, such as subsidy policy, taxpayer funds, reducing the taxpayer burden on certain sectors. So even though I disagree with those are arguments that should be compelling to anyone who subscribes to the idea of a free market capitalist society, because those two things are in contradiction. And so I think there are ways of appealing to people, even those who may ideologically not seem as close to us as close to myself, let's say, as maybe I would like them to be. And I think the issue of ethics is also important because ethics isn't just really political. Of course, historically, today, social justice obviously leans to the left, but animal cruelty and animal harm is something that outrages a conservative voter, a right-wing voter. You know, people who harm dogs are just as much condemned by the people on the right as they are on the left. And so actually, I think that the ethical argument here is another way of transcending some of these harder issues that we have, and encouraging people to recognize that regardless of what conspiratorial thinking or misinformation or disinformation that exists, when we just think about the animal issue more objectively, it speaks to something that the vast majority of us already believe in, which is that the way we treat animals is important. And as soon as we acknowledge that the way we treat animals is important, the question becomes, what's the most ethical way of treating an animal? And then the question becomes, is it more ethical to mutilate, exploit, and kill someone or not? And I think simplifying that down can be a good way of breaching through these problems. So, gosh, that could be a week-long seminar in itself, couldn't it? How to deal with this. But you are absolutely right. If only it was so simple as saying, here's the data, and people are going, brilliant, that's all I needed. But humans have never been like that, and probably never will be. But things will change, I think, because of a lot of reasons, which are included as well. Great question. Thank you. Yes.
So I just want to build on that question.
Yeah.
This is true, right? We kind of deal with the and in my experience, I see people respond more to the environmental or the aspect. And that leads them to ask you questions, well, what about that? Or what about, such a way that's well, and it's just
Yes.
Big question again.
Of course I can. The question was, there are many ways to get through to people. A lot of people respond well to the environment. A lot of people respond well to health. I imagine older generations particularly respond better to health because issues around the heart and colon cancers and things like this are obviously a more pressing issue the older you get. So health issues can play a big part in people changing. And one of the issues with ethics is that there are certain arguments that can exist. What about battery eggs? So say you have some hens at home, they lay an egg, can you scramble the egg? Or what about in a situation where animals aren't being intensively farmed? Let's say you have a cow. A cow does live what would be considered a good life. Can we then kill them? Does that make it ethical? And I think what's interesting is factory farming or intensive farming is just by and large the system of animal farming that exists. And most people will say they're against it, but still pay for it. And one of the reasons why we can kind of justify this to ourselves is because we have this kind of carrot on the end of the stick. And we go, well, but factory farming isn't the only system of farming. And we go, okay, well, what about a system where it's more ethical? And that's the important phrasing here, more ethical. Because while we may all agree, hopefully can reach some finality, that intensive farming, keeping mother pigs in gestation crates that are so small they can't even turn around for weeks at a time, 16 weeks often for the gestation period, locked in the cage where they can't turn around, most people are going to think that that's wrong, even though they pay for it. But then we say, well, what if that wasn't the case? Can we then do these things? The thing to recognize is that is more ethical. To take them out of those cages is obviously more ethical than to keep them in the cages. But is it the most ethical thing we can do? Let's say that you have a dog, and you have this dog, and every single day you take them for the best walks. Oh, the happiest dog. You play fetch with them every day. They get cuddles on an evening, they sit in front of the fire on your balcony, and a nice summer breeze comes in, and they are just having such a wonderful life. You know what? You love them. But after 12 months, you're going to kill them. Is that ethical? No, we don't believe it to be ethical. Because we don't want to think that it's okay to kill an animal just because we've treated them nicely. But undeniably, it's better that we treated them nicely than abused them for 12 months and then killed them. But we still killed them. So think about raising a child. You give a child a very, very happy life. They're very happy. That doesn't mean you can then slap your child, because the slap is what's unethical. And the slap itself is not morally justified because you haven't slapped them before, because you've given them a happy life, because in that moment, the action is unethical, irrespective of the things that came before it. And it's the same with the slaughtering of an animal. Sure, giving them a good life is important, but if you cut short that life by taking from them, that is when that action becomes unethical, because you're taking someone's life away from them. The only life they'll have, the only life we'll have, the life we have now. And I think what's interesting about this is when we view these issues from the perspective of the victim, because when we view ethical issues, it's important to view those ethical issues from the personal, the individual who has been harmed as a consequence of the choices we're making. When we think about situations where humans are being harmed or oppressed, we think about the cost to the victim. And so we put ourselves in the victim's shoes. That's what empathy is, viewing ourselves from the situation of someone else. And if we empathize with the animals and we view our existence from their position, we then say, would it be nice if our life was taken from us when we were living a happy life? And the answer is no. And actually, arguably, the taking of that life could even be crueler than an animal who was abused. Think about a chicken. In conventional farms, they live for 6 weeks. This is a life filled with suffering. They're selectively bred to grow so fast that their bones break, the organs fail, and often they can't move. Now, after 6 weeks, they're killed. And for those chickens, death would be really considered a mercy because it's the end of suffering. Now, that doesn't make it justifiable because the whole system should exist. But the death is probably the most compassionate thing that ever happened to the animal because their life has been so awful. And the death is obviously terrible in terms of the ethics of what we've done. But an animal is living a happy life. You're depriving them of the possibility to continue living that happy life. You're depriving them of the ability to experience more positivity, more joy, more happiness, more love. And to deprive an individual's experience these things, more of those things, could potentially be argued as being more unethical than to deprive an animal of experience more suffering, more harm, more fear, more terror. So, is it more ethical than factory farm? Yes. But is it more ethical than the alternative, which is to not do these things to animals in the first place? I'd argue no. Now, the backyard eggs thing is interesting. I don't want to be dogmatic. I think there's nothing more off-putting than when we create an idea and we become so rigid in that idea that we have no flexibility to consider it as something else. Because the truth is, there is an ethical animal product that exists, right? Not every animal product is as unethical as another. And so, for example, let's take roadkill, for example. I wouldn't recommend eating roadkill, probably filled with bacteria. But has the consumption of roadkill or an animal who has died naturally, is that contributing to more suffering? If you find a deer who's already dead in the forest, does eating that deer compromise an ethical violation? Well, probably not, because they're already dead. Now, one could argue that it's better to leave them for predators because then they're less likely to hunt another animal. But if you view that in a vacuum, it's not the same ethically as raising, mutilating, and slaughtering an animal. So the situation of a backyard egg, I think, is one of those situations where I wouldn't do it, and I think that there are ethical concerns. But if you compare that to buying eggs in the supermarket, they're very, very different actions. Now, the ethical concerns might be, where did you get your eggs from? Do you buy them from a breeder? Because if you did, then you're contributing to a system where male chicks are killed, because breeders will still buy hens from sort of commercial breeding facilities. If you rescue hens from a factory farm or from a free-range farm, and you give them a happy life and they have lots of space to roam around and they lay an egg, is that the same ethical relation? It's not. Now, you could feed the eggs back to them. I have a sanctuary, a co-owned sanctuary in the UK, and we have hens, lots of them, and we feed the eggs back to the hens. Because hens have been selectively bred to produce about 300 eggs a year. Naturally, their ancestors who we've sort of bred them from and, over many, many years, lay about 12 to 20. So they lay a lot more eggs than they used to. This has a huge impact on their bodies because the shell is made of calcium, there's lots of nutrients found within the egg. And so actually one of the biggest problems in the egg industry is osteoporosis and broken bones because the hens are so nutrient deficient because all the calcium that's been drained from their bones to create egg almost daily. So we feed the eggs back to the hens, they can eat the shells or part of the shells, they can replace a lot of these nutrients, and they really like them. I know it sounds weird, but these are unfertilized eggs, right? The ethical concern around feeding hens their own unfertilized eggs doesn't exist. So that's what we do. But I don't want to be dogmatic and say that everything is ethically the same from one egg to another, and that's what I would say. So I wouldn't recommend it. Try and feed the eggs back. Try to reduce the amount of eggs the hens lay, but ultimately that's not the same. And so if someone says that, you can concede to that. And conceding can be important in saying, look, I'm not saying that all things are the same morally, but buying animal products is contributing to the most immoral thing. My mum has chickens, for example. Would I rather use those eggs or buys eggs? It's not a business answer. Obviously, I probably shouldn't do either. But in that situation, it's more of a concession I think can be helpful to make. I felt I didn't word that the best I could have done, but I hope that somewhat explains it. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we can either do like one long more or maybe two short more, but let's.
I'll do short. I need so much.
Okay.
So first of all, congratulations for your very informative, marvelous, and passionate talk.
Thank you.
Now, the question is, some time ago, I looked at the statistics, and in the UK, United Kingdom, you had a huge consumption of meat.
Yeah.
And was higher than in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
About 130 kilograms per year, we were about 100. What has happened in the last 10 years? That you've been very successful in reducing this consumption. And now, in Italy, we are only 2% vegan. In UK, you're already 4%.
Mm.
What do you think was the good reason you gave to your country fellows? Was the ethical one, the environmental one, or was it the issue of health for old people that is not healthy? How did you manage to convince so many people to become vegan while in Italy you're still at 2% struggling?
Well, I think 2% is correct. I thought Italy was going to be not my 2%. Repeat the question, of course. Yeah. The question was, so the UK used to have a higher per capita meat consumption than Italy, but actually in recent years, particularly in the past 10 years, there's been a fairly consistent decline, particularly in red meat. And actually, most recent records show that the UK's consumption of meat is the lowest it's ever been since records began. And so we actually have a higher percentage of vegans. Polling suggests that Italy about twice as much, not twice as many. And the question is kind of like, well, why is this? I think a couple of reasons. Firstly, and this is an insult to the UK. When you think of UK cuisine, not a lot springs to mind, right? Fish and chips, obviously, is one. Pies and mash, sausages and mash. But when you think of a roast dinner, of course, or a fried breakfast, but when you think of places like Italy or France or even Spain, you think of a very clear food cuisine. France, obviously, is one of the worst places for veganism I've ever been to. And also has a cuisine that just revolves around things like foie gras, cheese, meats, all different types of foods. Here, obviously, there's a big focus on products, ham, obviously red meat, still an important part, and fish, obviously. And I think that to challenge people to change our food culture is easier because we have less of a history of food culture and less of an emotional tie to our food culture. And for things like pies and sausages, they're some of the easiest vegan foods to create to replicate, because sausages and pies are. It's not the same as a thinly sliced leg of ham, right? So it's easier to create a vegan version. So there's less of a worry of us missing out on our food culture. The other thing is the UK has a longer history when it comes to thinking about certain issues. The first animal welfare organisation in the world, the RSPCA, came from the UK. And so I think that we've naturally had a little bit more of this ingrained within our culture. We have less of a religious thing to consider. Here, religion is a big factor. And Catholicism as a religion places humans at the top of the pedestal and creates the idea that we have dominion over animals. And so by its very nature, it tells us that we can use animals. And so I think that plays a big part. The UK is far more secular. I don't encounter many religious arguments in the UK. And so we have less of an arrogance around our position as a species. I think that plays a part. We've also had some very successful campaign groups. The history of animal rights has often been in the UK and the US. We've had animal liberation for decades. We've had things like sort of the hunt saboteurs who would sabotage fox hunting in the UK, which is a big political and animal welfare issue. So we've had a long history of animal rights campaigning. We have an initiative called Veganuary, which I know is global and obviously exists here as well, but started in the UK and has had the majority of its success in the UK. So I think there's a few things that have allowed us within the past 10 years or so to kind of push this message. And also the UK culturally is not that diverse. Yes, of course, there's lots of differences between London compared to Newcastle or Cornwall compared to Manchester, but by and large, we're quite similar. Whereas places like Italy, the culture between the north and the south, I think, is far more pronounced. I think the infrastructure is not quite as developed. I think that awareness and information access is not quite as prevalent. And so I think that Italy is a little bit more in the past in many ways than the UK. And I think that means that it's a little bit slower to adopt certain things. But I think all of that plays a part, definitely plays a part. So yes, I believe for those. Yeah, great question. And I saw your hands as well, so I would love to. Cultivated meat. What's my view on cultivated meat? Easy. I mean, imagine this. We can have something that is meat, but doesn't mean killing an animal. Not only that, but there's no antibiotics, there's no E. coli, there's no salmonella, there's no bird flu, there's no swine flu. The environmental harm is significantly reduced. And of course, we can, over time, change some of the nutrition. If the technology allows us, we can create more healthy fats like mono and polyunsaturated fats and reduce the harmful fats like saturated fats. We could increase the amount of certain vitamins and nutrients. It gives us an element of flexibility to also make the food healthier and better for us, as well as being more sustainable and more ethical. So I think that's terrific. And I think it speaks to our intelligence that we can do such a thing. Now, look, it seems ridiculous to me that we need it. It seems ridiculous that we would have to use science to such an extent to get people to stop eating animals. But I'm also accepting of the fact that people like how they taste. I was the same. I had to go vegan because I woke up and decided steak was disgusting. I never did that. I always liked steak until the day I gave it up. And so I recognize that it's going to be hard to convince everyone just by talking about the virtues of plants. Some people will want that literal meat without all of the harm that comes with it. And I, for one, think that's brilliant. The problem, again, is how it's weaponized. Will it ever be culturally adopted? Will people see it as an attack on tradition, on heritage? Will it be banned? It's been banned here for now. In Poland, they're talking about banning it. And bear in mind, Poland has just had an election that has shifted more to the centre. So now the right's been removed, and it's someone from the EU who's now there, Donald Tusk, I think. And even they're talking about banning it. States across the US are talking about banning it. Basically, there is a huge challenge ahead, which is to create not only the technology to make it available and affordable, which will happen over time, but also make it culturally adopted. And there will be a huge amount of lobbying by the meat industry, by politicians trying to stop that. And one of the things they'll do is they will weaponize the idea of it being unnatural or like Frankensteinian food. And they'll try and say that it's not right, we shouldn't be science and technology, but farming is a product of science and technology. It only exists in the ways it does because of science and technology. The animals who we consume are products of science, not evolution. They are selectively bred, they are domesticated, and they have been changed, manipulated by us to suit our needs, to have more babies, to produce more milk, to lay more eggs, to grow fatter, quicker. The animals we consume are not natural animals. They are products of science, and so is cell-cultured meat. And one of the biggest ironies is there are actual medical facilities or scientific facilities where animals are tested on to make them more suitable for domestic agricultural purposes. There is something called gene editing, which would allow us to alter the genes of animals to make them blind, for example. And one of the things that they want to do in the US is make animals blind so they can be confined in smaller spaces, because they think if they can't see, it will be less stressful for them because they won't see the confinement they're kept in. Now, if we want to talk about cell-cultured meat being unnatural, well, then we should have a farming system in its very nature, because farming is unnatural. It is not a product of evolution, but of science. And cell-cultured meat is an embracing of progressive, positive science and a rejection of using science for unethical purposes, such as making animals blind or making them grow really, really fast. So I think it's great. But my fear is the narratives that will be created around it, because that will decide whether or not it's adopted culturally by the masses. But I have a lot of hope and confidence. And I think it's a very bright thing that I hope will bring about a lot of change. I think it's positive because of what it can and hopefully will achieve. So thank you for that great question. Love.
As long as we have questions, we can. So, are you guys okay with a few more minutes?
You can also leave.
Are you okay with it?
I'm fine. I'm absolutely fine. The doors are not locked. So you can leave.
If you have an appointment, leave. You will not bother anybody. And Ed, thanks so much.
Of course. Yeah, we've got Dan, yes.
Thank you.
So how do we get to the non-Western countries? Because I think that this is a question that can be applied to all kind of social justice issues and all issues. But this is such an urgent thing for the environment to do. It needs massive change. So how do we get, because of course we can do activism here, but and probably it's easier to change minds here. But how do we get to the non-Western countries?
Yeah. The question is, how do we get through to non-Western countries? Obviously, a lot of this messaging is centered on the West. A lot of the conversation is centered on the West. So what about non-Western countries? The first thing to recognize is that the impact of Western countries is higher than the impact of non-Western countries. When we think about the number of animals being farmed, the intensification, when we think about the numbers of animals and the environmental harm that comes as a consequence, as well as the ethical harm, still the West is the biggest driver of that. And so actually the impact that we have is greater. So the impact of us changing is greater than if we were to change, say, in Southeast Asia, certainly, of course, Africa, the continent of Africa, and even in places such as China, where the intensification of animal farming is obviously ramping up and the issue is becoming more prevalent. It's a different beast in many ways. So the first thing to recognize is actually it's not a bad thing that it's happening a lot here, because here's where it needs to happen the most. And the other thing to recognize is that the choices that we have do impact the other countries. So, for example, we spoke about soy farming. Obviously, if the EU stopped importing soy to feed animals, that would significantly change how farmers and producers in South America use their land. So that would open the door for things to change in places like that. And the other thing to bear in mind is things like fishing, for example. Now, the EU and China, the EU has a huge number of shipping vessels that supply marine animals to European countries. And part of the problem with this is that a lot of these shipping vessels go into waters around Africa and will remove trillions of fish. In fact, we remove globally about up to 2.3 trillion fish from our oceans every single year. 2.3 trillion. Such a huge number. And when these shipping vessels go into waters around the coastal regions of Africa and remove fish from those areas, they're removing food for those communities. And what that does is that drives people in those areas to have to find food differently. So one thing that happens is it drives agriculture. So it increases the belief that cattle farming is necessary. And so we're increasing cattle farming across African nations. It also increases the consumption of bushmeat, so hunted animals, which has a knock-on effect for the sustainability of wild animals in these areas of the world, and also increases the risk of things like Ebola, which can come from the hunting of wild animals in many African nations. And so what we have is a huge knock-on effect. And so again, the impact that we have transcends beyond just our borders and can have a positive impact in other areas. And also, we in many ways are driving the changes that are happening in non-Western nations. These countries like in Vietnam and Thailand, which are intensifying poultry farming, are using the technology that we've had for decades, and they've been using for decades. And so I think one thing we have to be careful of is creating a solution here and then pointing the finger and creating a pariah out of nations who are doing what we have done and what we have taught them to do. It was the same with cars, diesel cars. We had diesel cars were bad, but then diesel cars were becoming very accessible in places like China. And then we go, oh, look, China, see diesel cars. The problem stems from a lot of what we're doing. But the positive to that is that if a lot of what's happening stems from technology that we've been using, we can also positively influence through technology that we're using as well. And the thing about China is that even though it's so large and obviously its pollution is so great, it also has a culture that is a lot around plants, like tofu, a lot of vegetables. There's a history of those foods. Obviously, there's lots of pork and animal products that are consumed. But I think that food shift is less of a risk or less of a challenge than it would be in places like the US or here or France, for example. And so I think that the ability to shift food culture might be easier there in many ways. I also think that there is, and this isn't a good thing overall, this is a bad thing, but the influence of governments in places like China is far greater than the influence of government where we live. And so, for example, the Chinese government announced a few years ago that they wanted the Chinese population to reduce the amount of meat they eat by 50%. Now, if it got to the point where the problem became so large that the Chinese government decided that something had to be done, they very much have the ability to do that. I don't say this is a good thing. I don't like the idea of political parties having the ability to enforce things, but obviously there are positives that can come. It's complex, isn't it? So there are certain sort of socio-political factors that I think make that transition happen probably quicker than it will in many Western nations. So overall, the important thing is that we do change. Our change will have a positive effect on many other areas of the world, many other nations, even other continents. The technology that we implement can then be used in these other places and made more accessible and offered to them. And I think that the food culture in these other places is often more focused on plants and many plant proteins like legumes, soy, for example, than we've had in our history. So that's what I would say. But it's a big problem. And what we don't want is for things to spiral out of control in places like China. And the problem is Africa right now is seen as a very prosperous place for lots of reasons. For example, for lithium farming, but also for agriculture. And so what we see happening in many nations is that a lot of these big companies are recognizing that the market is shifting and turning their attention to areas of the world that they still can see as being ripe for financial extraction and exploitation. And so now there are a lot of these big Chinese-owned multi-story pig farming facilities being created in many countries in Africa, in different places across the continent, because it's seen as an area where the food can be produced and, importantly, the impact can be denied. And what happens in the EU and what happens in the UK is that because we import so much food from abroad, feed from abroad, farmers here can claim that that's not their problem. And so a lot of the numbers that we see are skewed. So in the UK, we hear about the X percentage of emissions come from animal farming. But what they don't take into account is the emissions produced from the soy being produced in South America, the deforestation, importation. And that's exactly what can happen when we start to use other countries to produce the food that we want to produce. It allows us to think very highly of ourselves. And by us, I mean the companies, not us as individuals. But it allows these countries to show themselves as being progressive. Look, we're doing the right thing. Look what the stats are showing. But actually, they're just changing where these emissions are being produced or changing where the harm's being done and causing huge socio-economic problems in these regions and actually denying indigenous people and people within these nations the ability to create a better farming system themselves. Because again, when we talk about farming in different regions, a lot of this farming is done because it's cheap, because it's easy for us to then import it in. And then that has repercussions for the people in those countries who have less food, have less land, have less resources, and less opportunities to create a functioning agricultural system for themselves. And that becomes a human rights issue. Water usage, land usage, but to create food or products for us in affluent nations. So again, the changes we make are very important in that. And undeniably, China has to become a part of this as well. But there is progress there, even though it's slow, as it is everywhere, sadly. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Roughly 50 years since of Peter Singer's animal liberation. Now he's asked about it, like when I played these years, he said something like, oh, the one hand, anti-speciesism is really taken seriously and being easier than ever. On the other hand, in terms of like the quantity and quality of life of farmed animals, it's like the worst ever.
Yes.
So I'm curious about your forecast for the future. Like 50 years after the publication of This is Vegan Propaganda, what do you expect you will say in interviews? What do you expect for?
Well, sadly, I don't think I'll be down to the job. I repeat the question. I'll get it right at the end. There's a philosopher, a very famous philosopher called Peter Singer, who's renowned for work in different philosophical fields. But one of his most highly sort of esteemed areas is in animal rights. And he's often referred to as the godfather of animal rights. He published a book in 1974, I believe, yes, exactly, 1974-75, called Animal Liberation. And the purpose of the book was to compel people to think about the issue of animal ethics in a way that hadn't been really done before in the philosophy community. Still often isn't. And in the book, he popularized this term called speciesism. And this term was actually coined by someone called Richard Ryder, who I think is at the University of Oxford or Cambridge, and used to take part in animal testing. He was a vivisectionist. And then started to see the problems, ethical problems within some of that, and coined this term speciesism, which is the idea that we discriminate animals based on their species. So they're only a pig. The reason we can gas them is because they are a pig. That's a form of speciesism. We're saying because of who they are, that makes the exploitation acceptable. Now, obviously, in 1974, or 1975, it was very controversial. To this day, it's still seen as quite controversial. But when he's asked about it, what's changed in the past 50 years? You're kind of viewed as this very highly regarded philosopher, not without his controversy, but a highly regarded philosopher, particularly in this field. So have you been successful? Have things changed? 50 years later, and clearly the answer is no, he hasn't. I did an event with him last year. And I don't say this to say, as far as I'm saying, right, this may be a little bit of a misquote. We basically said, so far it's failed because the issue is worse. There are now more animals being farmed and killed in worse ways than before, and not efficient on a scale that's never been done before. So actually, in the past 50 years, the issue has got worse. Worse in terms of numbers, worse in terms of practices. It's never been as bad as it is now. So there's a certain paradox. We talk about increasing vegan awareness. Veganism is an issue that's never been more prevalent than it is now. And yet the problem has never been more severe than it is now. How can these two things be true? So I published two books, but my first book was published 2 years ago called This is Vegan Propaganda. Just recently got an Italian translation, which is super exciting. So the question was, gosh, how does it take you so long to say something that took you 5 seconds to say? The question is, in 50 years, do I think that things will be the same or worse or different? I think it will be a mixture. I think that what I have on my side in terms of the time frame compared to Peter is technology. Cell-cultured meat being one, awareness being another. Back 50 years ago, the awareness around health issues was very, very, very low. The awareness around environmental issues was non-existent. No one's thinking about animal farming as an environmental problem. The issue around antibiotics was more or less non-existent. There had been concerns and warnings, but really antibiotics were used, very, very easily. Bird flus and swine flu. So we have a far greater understanding of the problems now. Culturally, I think we are more in alignment with trying to create a solution now. So it's not just an awareness, but I think culturally we are. And I think technologically we have more innovations, cell-cultured meat, plant-based alternatives, and just a better abundance of plant foods in general. Because veganism isn't about plant-based burgers. It's about fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, healthy whole foods, which is what we should be eating the most of. And so I think we can have more abundance of these foods now because of the globalization of our agricultural system, which is problematic, but also very helpful as well. So, but the problem is going to be gone. And what we have is a really interesting thing. We spoke about population growth, and this is where it gets a little bit frightening, I suppose, because let's say I turn one person vegan tonight. Okay, great, fantastic. But in the time that I've been speaking, there's been thousands of children born, right? And how many of those have been born into vegan families, right? So every second is a losing battle. You have to turn 2 people vegan a second just to keep the momentum going, because every second a non-vegan child or baby is being born probably into a non-vegan family. So, goodness gracious me, it becomes this thing where vegans are increasing, but because population is increasing, so are the number of meat eaters. Add to that people are eating more because of increasing affluence in certain areas of the world, intensive farming, making it affordable and more accessible. And then add to this that very, very well-intentioned environmentalists will hear what I have to say and what the science is, and will cut out red meat. Do they go vegan? Not necessarily. They might eat chicken or fish instead. And so the UK has a decline in terms of weight, but actually chicken has gone up. And globally, of course, fish continues to go up. And a lot of that is being driven by vegetarians or pescatarians or just meat eaters who are giving up red meat to choose something more sustainable, but don't want to give up meat entirely. So it's really tricky. And it's just like this all the time. You take one step forward, you take 2 steps back. You think you're making progress, then something happens, and it becomes really difficult. So I think the world will be in a better place in 50 years on this issue than it has been comparatively for Peter in the 50 years since he published his book. But I don't think it'll be where I want it to be. Yeah, no, sad. Thank you, good question.
So at this point, I think unless there is a really urgent question, let's get it done. What do you think?
I'm happy.
Yeah, because we all have to dinner and drink something eventually.
That's true.
Is there a really urgent question?
No urgent.
Or a small one?
Oh, we've done this before. We'll be here at midnight. We're going to promise I'll shorten it, but if it is a very quick one. I do. I have a very long, detailed answer to that give you. In all seriousness, bee production. People think that honey is good for the environment because we need more bees. But the problem is honeybees are one species of bee. There are 20,000 different species of bees that exist on this planet. I think it's 20,000 in the UK alone. It's a huge number. The honeybee is one bee. The problem with honeybees is they are very aggressive. They are very, very good at taking nectar, but they're also not very good at pollinating. So what happens when you have honey, especially organic biological honey, is you create a system where honeybees are often introduced into an ecosystem and outcompete natural pollinators. What that does is it drives natural pollinators away, but because honeybees are not as good at pollination as many natural pollinators, it reduces the biodiversity and reproduction of wildflowers and plants. So actually what we see is that when honeybees are introduced into areas, the amount of flora can decrease, and it has a negative impact on the environment and actually disrupts natural pollination. What we need and what we want are less agricultural honeybees, because remember, honeybees are a domesticated agricultural animal, and they exist in the numbers they do because of agriculture, not because there should be that many in nature. So we need to save the bees, and actually one of the best things we can do to save the bees is to stop consuming honey and encourage natural wild pollinators. How do we do that? Take farmland away from animals and rewild it. The more rewilding, the more flora, the more flowers and wildflowers, the more flowers needing pollination, the more natural pollinators, the more bees of all different types of species. And that's really, really important. Honey is a problem. It's not a solution. It's one of the biggest drivers of the very problem. And it's also often very unethical. Honeybees are often killed in commercial honey production as well. If you want any more information on honey, I have my book. I write about it in my book as well. So if it's something that interests you, in my first book and in my second book, I touch upon honey and honeybees, why it's unethical and why, importantly, it's actually a serious environmental problem. So maybe that tantalizes you to pick up a copy of my book. Sold in all good retailers. Thank you so much. Very much.
Thank you so much, Ed. I think all of us here from Trieste, from Slovenia, from the region are extremely happy that you honored us by coming, and you did this actually squeezing it in between your tour, and it's incredible. Thanks so much.
It's my honor to be here, so thank you.
And if I can just have 2 more minutes of your time, then you can all go off to well-served dinner. I would just like to show you what we have in Trieste in terms of vegan initiatives. So first of all, Linda and me, the organizers of today, we have a small page called Vegan Survival Trieste, where we just show some of the good foods we find here. So you can see that we were making a commercial about Ed, but we also share apple burek from Sejana. That's accidentally vegan, it's very good. Then the biggest vegan page here we have is Vegan Meetup Trieste. And we also have Martina, one of the founders of Vegan Meet. I don't know if Atina is also here. Atina and Martina, the founders here. There will be a vegan picnic very soon, I think. So please follow them on Instagram. And there is a lot of nice initiatives and good people you can meet. The vegan picnics are amazing. Furthermore, we have Animal Rebellion. There is Giovanni here, who's also an organizer of Fridays for Future, Animal Rebellion, and so many other things here. Today, Animal Rebellion and Anonymous for the Voiceless, which are animal rights activism groups. And Giovanni will also stay here a few more minutes. If you would like to talk to him, to maybe join some of the actions that they did. Anonymous for the Voiceless are people who are basically using the anonymous masks, the V for Vendetta masks, and doing some action on the streets, talking to people about the cruel things of animal agriculture. And I think you also collaborate with them. You collaborate with everybody. So it's great. And unfortunately, I also have to talk about something really sad that happened in Trieste. Tomorrow, there is going to be a trial of Laura Sorresini, who's an animal rights activist with Animal Rebellion and also other groups. And she is being trialed, and the prosecutors are trying to apply anti-mafia laws to her and put her under maximum surveillance. They collected a laundry list of her activism that she did in order to silence her. And this is actually a very frightening attack on our civil rights. So Linda and me are going to be there together with Giovanni. If you have time tomorrow at 9, please come to the Tribunale of Trieste and join us. I think it's important that we show presence. Laura did so much and we can support her a bit. And this Friday there is the global climate strike. And while other nations like the UK and Germany get a lot of people on the streets, in Italy it's harder, especially in Trieste. We're happy if we get our few hundred people. So if somebody's interested there, also please go on the Fridays for Future page and join us. And thank you so much for coming. Also from far, I know. And thank you, Ed, for coming. Have a lovely evening.